All right. Thanks for being here today with at least, I would say, a writer of at least poetry, essays, novels, and screenplays, Jack Remick. And again, thank you for being here. I look forward to this conversation
Well, it's my
because,
pleasure. I really appreciate you reaching out like this to creative
yeah,
people across the country because we really need something to unite us, and it might as well be art.
yeah, I like that's one of the reasons I went to writing groups was not necessarily to have anything I've written read by anyone, but more of to just establish that connection with that type of people. And it's all different types of people, all sorts of strangeness, and the conversations you can get into is pretty great. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I
yeah,
really appreciate the fact that Zooming like this with this kind of connection opens us up to a whole range of writers that we would never meet in person, like in a bookstore or a class or something. I run a weekly workshop called Interactive Rewrite, and I have people in that class in Canada, Mexico, Kansas, Florida. It's just really exciting to meet people all over the country who are expressing themselves in many, many forms, poetry, essays, memoirs, novels. So we share that excitement about what's happening in America right now.
yeah, it's it would be interesting to see what the classics would write about if they had this type of technology, like Hemingway's, the movable feast might be a little different. I mean, maybe he'd still be walking down the river in Paris, but I mean, when you duck in to talk to somebody else,
Uh, that's a good
Fitzgerald's just a call away.
That's a great image, Hemingway walking beside the river looking for somebody to talk to. I really
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, I think that the technology would open their minds even greater. I've studied French literature a bit, and I often wonder what Balzac would have done with a typewriter. What would
Hmm.
Dumas have done with a typewriter? Who knows what they would have produced? So it's pretty exciting to see how the technology has opened us up to a world that a few years ago, well, in fact, before the self-publishing or the POD world came into existence, a lot of us didn't have a way to get our work out except in, reading with other friends or stuff like that. And now it's a whole new world. And I see a lot of work coming out that would simply have been on somebody's shelf hidden if it hadn't
Hmm.
been for the technology. So I really like what it's done for us. Maybe it's done something also to us, but certainly done a lot for us.
Yeah. When you think about yourself as a writer, are there times where you think like that you're a poet or that you're an essayist or that you're a novelist? Are there times when you're working on something that you feel more like one than the other? And if somebody asked you, what do? You would say, I'm a novelist or I'm a
That's a
writer.
great question because when I first started writing, I started as a poet and then I branched out into fiction. And I could often tell just by maybe the first couple of sentences that what I was writing is a short story, a novel, a poem. And so I would just follow the heat. My rule is always follow the heat, whatever comes, follow the heat. Because I just read a quote from Raymond Chandler, or about, I think it's from Raymond Chandler, but with the web being what it is, you never know if something is apocryphal or made up.
Right.
He said, when I'm writing fast, I know I'm writing well because the words are pushing me. If I'm writing slow, I know I'm pushing the words. So what he's saying is, let her rip, baby, you know. So I
Yeah.
kind of fell into that in my own way. And as a result, what comes out is what comes out. And I remember first going to Natalie Goldberg's uh, timed writing workshops. I don't know if you're familiar with Natalie, but she says mind connects to mind, writing gets more writing, let it rip, turn on your timer and write and don't stop until the timer goes off. So I took that to heart, and I started one morning, I was actually lying in bed, and I had just been to a writing practice session the night before. I picked up my pen and I wrote a poem called Breathless. And it goes, I took first communion on the steps of the jazz cellar, too young to buy my own booze, too dumb to steal it. I heard Rexroth rip the nation naked over the beat of conga drums and horns crystal in the night. And that's just, the opening of the poem.
Mm-hmm.
Could never have written that had I sat down and said, I'm going to write a poem.
Mm.
Just didn't work. And that has been my guiding light ever since. Start writing and don't stop writing until you fall over or fall asleep. So you ask me that question, my answer is, I don't know what's going to come out. Hell, maybe I should just go wash dishes. Maybe the creative impulse really says, go clean your bathroom or something. Instead, it
Y-
comes as a novel. And
Yeah.
pretty successful for me, just taking what comes. I have a couple adages that I really like to share with other writers, like the art is in the rewrite. Well, what does that mean? Well, that you got to have something to rewrite, so you got to write first. I've studied
Mm-hmm.
university for a few years in screenwriting and novel and memoir, and my students after one session gave me a T-shirt that had a writing on it that said, "Why do I write? So I have something to rewrite." 'Cause you can't rewrite it unless you got it, and if the art's in the rewrite, then, well, baby, you're pretty much strapped, this is what you got to do.
Yeah.
Thing that I attach onto that also then is that discipline is your obligation to the gift. You get this thing written down, and I know a lot of writers. I used to work with a group called Seattle 5+1. We were a poetry performance group. And we'd go to these sessions and we would read, we'd all work our stuff and work it and rework it. And then we'd go to other places where writers would walk in and they say, I just wrote this on the bus on the way over here. And, it missed that point about the rewrite, discovering what is in the rewrite that only comes out when you
Mm.
subject it to the discipline that you require to make it. And so I have always made it a rule, rewrite before you send it out. A lot of writers publish too soon when their work. Well, tacking onto that TR, I have this notion that often our ideas when we're writing, we've all got great ideas, but we often don't have the techniques to handle the power of those ideas.
Mm.
So you kind of have to wait until you've got the techniques to handle the ideas. If you send it out too early, the editor's going to send it back and they'd say, this needs work. And frankly, I'll tell you, I've gotten back a lot of work of my own that said, this needs work. And that was sort of the key, you know, don't send it out too soon. Keep
Mm.
it with you. Don't keep it till you die. Nobody sees it, but don't send it out too soon. So that's what I tell a lot of my writers in this interactive rewriting workshop. Let's work it. Let's massage it. Let's find the right words. Let's get the techniques into the text. So that's, just one of the, I think that's a driving light or driving force in my art. And that's why I've been able to, I've got 3 books of poetry. I've Seattle 5+1 with other writers. It's an anthology. I have Satori, which is a collection of my work. And then I have a long poem called Josie Delgado, a poem of the Central Valley. And all of those were written in that same, what I'd call the white zone, where you're letting go and you're sort of floating in this mix of creative juices and
Mm.
you don't know what's going to come out. Uh, one writer I know called it white flow. He described it perfectly as when you let go of where you are and what you know and take the risk. You have to take the risk of diving into something that you don't know and letting that come out because you have no idea what your unconscious mind is going to produce. And that's the power of Natalie Goldberg's writing practice. Uh, Let it go, write it down, don't stop, and then go back and edit. And so that's becomes almost her world, if you follow that, becomes a very productive world. Because she herself, I don't know if you've read her book, Writing Down the Bones or those things, but she
I
lays
haven't.
out how to access your unconscious mind as a writer. And she goes beyond form to, she says writing is the form. And she's speaking like the neuroscientists do, about saying, well, the unconscious is working all the time, 24/7, 365, all of your life. And you've got to open up a pathway for it to spill out what it's got stored up in there. And that's where the discipline comes in, I think. In one of my last week in my workshop in the writer's interactive rewriting thing, I have a painter in there. Her name is Carol Ovenberg, and she has been in the past what they call, I think they call it photo realism, photographic realism. She'll look at a photograph and then paint the painting out of that.
Mhm.
And so I said, okay, look, guys, this is where we are as writers. We can't go to abstraction. If we go to abstraction, we get kind of surreal and we lose our reader. And I said,
Mm.
Carol is showing us that as writers, we have to stay where we are. Then the next image I show is a piece of hers called Bones, which is a triptych of 3 drawings in black and white of it looks like bones and is ossified something. And I tell the right, well, what do you see? And I said, well, I see black and white. And then she gives me another picture that's a pure abstraction. And I say, this is the process that we as writers have to be aware of. We can't get too far away from the words or we get lost in some abstraction. And,
Mm.
you'd be surprised at how much clarity that gives to a piece of writing. If you say, okay, I have to write in images, I have to write in action. And that takes you all the way back a couple thousand years to the Greeks who said that, poetry should be a speaking painting and a painting should be a silent poem. Wow, but they're still
Mm.
talking about images.
Yeah.
And that's we get to things like that. So here I'm dominating this thing there, TR.
Dominate, dominate. What do
Yeah.
you think of, or how do you visualize that white zone
White
of
flow,
your, yeah,
white
how do you,
flow.
where do you think that poetry comes from? If it's living in a place that's outside of you,
Yeah.
have you ever
That, of
visualized
course,
what
is
it
one
is?
of the great questions of all time. And I ask it where does it come from? So in order to find that place where it might be coming from, I started reading a lot of work, not of novelists, but of the neuroscientists, because they're telling us how the brain works these days. They can actually, with the fMRI, give us a picture of what happens in the brain when you see the color red or when you see a slanted line. And one of the things that impressed me a great deal about that was I saw an episode of the brain, I think it's called Perception Deception, where a guy named Michael Gazzaniga is one of the big lights in neurosciences, and he's trying to figure out what consciousness is. He's written a book called The Consciousness Instinct, and trying to then figure out what does the unconscious do. So they got this rapper, pretty well-known rapper, I can't remember his name. They put him in an fMRI machine, and told him to, give us a rap. So he did of one that he knew. And lo and behold, this part of his brain lit up. They said, okay, we're going to give you a start line. I want you to rap on this, make it up. So he started rapping on that, and a different part of his brain lit up. And that seems to be the creative, I'm making up a phrase here, the creative cortex that
Mm.
is somewhere in your brain. And I think that's where poetry comes from. This guy took a start line and created a rap song out of it. And a rap song is kind of a poem.
Mhm.
So, I think that if you let yourself go, using Natalie Goldberg's notion, let her rip, take what comes, keep the hand moving, don't cross out, don't edit. I think the one time she said, keep writing because you have only this moment to write it in, but you have the rest of your life to edit it in. So she's
Mm.
saying, carpe diem, take advantage of the moment, let that baby pour out. And boy, do I subscribe to that, you know. And the result of that in my own work has been I will sit down, TR, and write for half an hour. I used to set the clock for 45 minutes when I was writing with a public group. I will set the clock for half an hour, and 30 minutes later, I come out and I read stuff and say, where did that come from? Well, it came from letting go, not editing, and Natalie Goldberg has a rule. If you're writing and you get stuck, keep your hand moving. Repeat the last word you wrote. So if you get, I'm stuck, I'm stuck, I'm stuck, I'm stuck, and then
Mm.
pretty soon it springs you free, you know, and you get these magnificent, magnificent things coming out. Sometimes you don't even know what they are till you start to rewrite them. So I hope that answers that's what I think is going on. The brain is hoarding all these things and we have to find a way to let it out. And I think that technique of timed writing is one way. I know poets who improvise at the piano and they're doing the same thing at the piano that they're doing with their words. So it seems to be pretty much the the accomplished artist understands that you can't control it. It will control you.
Mm.
And I think that there's a guy named George Gallo who is an impressionist painter. I read a deal by him. Apparently, he's written about, no, excuse me, he has painted about 3,000 paintings, and he's also a screenwriter. He wrote three very famous screenplays. You probably heard of Midnight Run,
Mhm.
Goodfellas, and another one called Local Color. And
Mm.
he was interviewed and he said, I came to realize that all the arts are interconnected, that character is like color in painting, that words are like, I have the quotes. If later I'll send it to you because it's
Okay.
sort of formative in understanding how the arts are interconnected. They're not separate, you know. Uh, they're they the techniques that each artist uses turns out to have some correlative in some other art. It's just stunning, how integrated it is. But it takes a mind like George Gallo or Natalie Goldberg to fit all that together. And that's really exciting that we're living in a time, when it used to be, oh, it's divine inspiration or it's the oracle speaking. And lo and behold, it's the human unconscious that is with us. And it's just pouring this stuff out, you know. And I do think that you have to work it. I do think you have to edit it, you know.
Yeah. You've talked about this before as far as not just sitting down to write poetry, but certainly there's probably times where you do sit down and say, okay, I'm going to work on these thoughts and I'm going to rewrite this thing that I've already worked on that came whenever it came. But
Hmm.
now you have a time set aside for it. Do you do that when the mood strikes, or do you have a specific time where you try to train yourself to do this certain thing at this certain time?
That's a hard question, TR, because it's kind of, when we used to wait for inspiration, we'd spent a long time waiting,
Mm.
but what I learned from using the timed writing technique is, and this relates to what you do, at the moment. Uh, as I listen to other writers write under the clock with the timed writing, I would see that the first 5 minutes are pretty much known stuff. They're
Mm.
writing off of ideas that they have. Natalie apparently likes to sit down and make a list of what she's going to write about. Then she writes for half an hour and goes back to see what she's actually covered. And what I saw and still see in some of the writers is that first 5 minutes is stuff they already know. That rest of the 25 minutes of the 30-minute session is new stuff that they're uncovering. So if you go into it waiting for something to happen, you just never know. And I think that I said earlier, follow the heat, go with the heat.
Mhm.
So you sit down to write, I'm working on a poem, and you get an idea. Here's an idea that came the other day. I was sitting down, I'm working on a new novel called The Last of the Best. And this line just came as I was in the middle of writing. It said, humans have become resigned to their own extinction. Well, where did that come from? I have no idea. It just popped into my brain. So you see, that's why I'm saying take what comes. You never know where you will use it. And so the discipline is understanding that you're not in control.
Yeah.
That sounds weird. I know, and you're a poet, so you know exactly what I mean. You
Yeah,
know,
I would say that discipline is writing down those things when they occur. So
exactly, exactly.
I've missed the chance plenty of times to where I now realize I got to write that down. I'm not going to remember it. If I'm
Perfect.
in if I wake up from sleeping and think, well, I don't really want to write that down because I want to stay sleeping. No, you got to write it down. If you're
Exactly.
somewhere and you hear something and you filter that through your mind and it comes out into a line, either from a novel, from a character that you're working on, a novel that from a character you don't know yet, or just a random poetic thing, you got to write it down. And then eventually you're going to work on that through that rewriting and you're going to find out where it does go. But yeah, I agree, that's the discipline. And
Yeah.
that's the difference between a writer and not a writer is,
There you
did
go.
you write that thought down when you had it?
Exactly, exactly. Well, you touched on it really there. What you said, is it a character that you don't know or one you do know? All those things. That's telling you that it's all there. You just have to
Mm,
get it out. But you got to let it out when it wants to come out. You can't control it. And that's perfectly right. You've probably written some really good poems while you were dreaming. And then you get
mhm.
up and say, well, I won't write it down. It was just a dream. And boy, did you miss the boat, you know.
Yep. And maybe sometimes those thoughts reoccur and you recognize it and you go,
Yeah,
oh, this is that same thought or that same line of thinking that I've tapped into before. I just didn't catch it. So now I
that's
need
right.
to. And sometimes it comes back around and sometimes it doesn't. And you
Yeah.
know that it's never coming back. And I like the way you can recognize it. That's why when I visualize poetry or the place that poetry comes from, I think, yes, it comes from within us to where we experience things and whatever's going on inside of this human body,
Hmm.
that it manifests something and then those are ideas.
Yep.
But I also think it comes from somewhere else, whether it's another world, another dimension, more ethereal, something that the way I visualize it is a dark forest. And we have our world and we have other worlds. And this other world where I feel like there is some sort of communication that's trying to come through. You have this division, and it's this dark forest. It's not so dark you can't see, but it's like a twilight type forest. And you can walk around in that forest and have conversations and thoughts with things from the other side. And they don't come over into your world and you don't go over into theirs, but you're in this area in the middle. And for poetry, that seems like the place for me and how I visualize it, where poetry comes from. Writing a novel is different, but
Well, I think you nailed it. I really think
mm,
it that other place, that other world. The French poets, the symbolist poet, used to call the au-delà, the beyond, something
mm,
beyond. And you characterize the dark forest. It's sort of an impenetrable place where you kind of afraid to go, but you're already there and you're working in it and you're taking what's coming. And that
mhm,
idea then connects very much, I think, to something you touched on really here, the difference between feeling and emotion. Feeling is something that's really deep. You don't even have words for it. Comes from a different part of the brain. Like you see a bear in the woods and your first thought is, oh, there's a bear. No, the first
mm,
thing that comes is a hair stands up on the back of your neck and you say, run, baby, run. See that kind of,
yeah,
to me, that's feeling. That's the essence of poetry, I think, is that
mm,
indescribable, the French call it ineffable, that you can't really understand. You just feel it. and it's different from sad or happy or angry. Those are
Mm,
emotions we can name, but that deep feeling that comes from that dark forest is what drives the pen across the paper, and the words for magically take shape, and you don't know where they come from, but that feeling has got to be there first. And you characterize it really well, and I think that's a good place for a poet to be. These words are coming from somewhere. I don't control it. There's that big old space out there, and you know, the Greeks used to. I think Herodotus or one of them says, uh, he says, "Why did you quit speaking to me?" They used to think they were taking dictation from the gods.
mm,
When the poet would come,
yeah.
and there's some of that in us still today. We still think, if I write this down, where did that come from? It came from the dark place, that undescribably dark place. We're still in it, but I think it's a good metaphor. I think you should write an essay on. I don't like to
Mm,
use the word should, but you should write an essay on that, TR.
yeah. I
That'd be
have
good for.
I have plenty of poems on the idea of where poetry comes from and just those
Uh-huh.
feelings. And the I think the second poetry book I wrote is called Halfway Through Strangeness, and that's
Hmm.
how I define that dark forest is that
Hmm.
strangeness. And
Hmm.
you can't go all the way through it because you're not supposed to go to the other side, and they're
Correct.
not supposed to go to your world.
Yeah.
But you can go halfway into that forest, and
Yeah.
you can meet them there, and maybe you're bestowing some feelings to them and they're bestowing some feelings to you. And I don't know how to describe it, but I know that it feels like it's from outside of me. And I do like the way the Greeks and the Romans thought of it,
Yeah.
especially when they talked about genius and it
Yeah.
being not the person, but the thing
Yeah,
outside of
I
you.
understand that. Yeah. Well, I think you touch on it really well. They give you something. You said they give you something, you give them something. And what they give you is that little gift. It can be an idea, it can be a feeling, it can be something. You come back to the white light world and you write that down, I mean, but your discipline is taking their gift and transforming it into words because all we've got are words. You
Mm-hmm.
know, Beckett, Beckett asked when he was doing an interview, Samuel Beckett, and they said, "Well, if you think all of this is what I forget the word, nonsense, or it's just fake or whatever it was, why do you write?" And he thought for a second. He says, "Because words are all I've got." And that's all we've got, is words. And so in that dark space, they hold out a hand and say, "Here, take this." And that's a metaphor for the little gift. And you bring it back and you turn it. What was the book title that you just said?
Halfway through strangeness.
Okay, halfway through strange.
Yeah.
So you get halfway. Now that's a
No,
good metaphor. As a poet, you speak in metaphor, and I like that a lot. Uh,
yeah.
but
That one. And then the third poetry book is called Barriers to Us.
barriers. Oh yeah, yeah.
And I think that one of the things I worried about with poetry, because I was just thinking I was going to write one poetry book and then that'd be out of my system and I can go on and continue with
Sure, it'll get
novels.
out of your system. Boy, you're funny. Not only are you a
Yeah.
poet, you're funny.
But
I'm sorry. Yeah.
I worried about not being able to write again. So I was like, well, I'll just do this. And then I did set time aside for a year and trying to write 10 poems a month. And usually I wrote more than that. Of course, in the book, you you choose what you're going to publish. But I worried that I would try to write and it wouldn't be there. And I've I don't know if it's with confidence of writing or confidence that that place is always going to be there because it always has. But it's if you show up, it's there. It's always there. It's
Yep.
you could be anywhere at any time and get into that state of mind and it's there.
Yep.
It's not going away. It's always there. That's why I think it's when I visualize it, it's a place. It's not just a state of mind. It's somewhere you can enter into. And it's not always nice. It's not always friendly, but I don't think it's evil. And
Oh
I don't
no.
think it's necessarily evil or good. And if I had a theme in all of my writing that connected everything, whether it was a science fiction story or a regular adventure fiction, a historical fiction, or poetry, I think my theme that I can step back and look at is good and evil. And
Yep.
it's not about good versus evil. It's just about good and evil and
Good
what
and
makes
evil.
good good and what makes evil evil.
Yeah. Well, I'm listening to you here and I'm saying that that place of will it be there? Will it be there? Will I find it again? I think all writers confront that. And that's one of the things that writing practice or timed writings that Natalie Goldberg laid out is so good because it says it's there. You just have to let it come. And so
Yep.
what you do is you set the timer for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, doesn't matter. And you just write. Just let it come. And if you keep the hand moving, that space opens up to you, it spills out. The darkness yields its gifts to you, and you go back and you say, okay, I've got this on the page, I got this much, but I can only use the first 16 lines or the last 4 lines. But that's
Mm-hmm.
the gift. And I
Yep.
think you nail it. See, as a practicing poet, you know exactly what we're talking about here, you know, and I think
What
it's
do you,
good.
what do you do when do you have times where you get overwhelmed with all of the lines or the notes that you take? There's a guy, a famous poet, I think he's a teacher out in California somewhere. Ewan maybe is his
Mm,
name, but he's I feel bad I don't know the name. I need to write down. But he's got a bunch of YouTube videos and he talks about writing poetry. And one of them is he says he writes it down with pencil and paper and then he does crossing through of things and shapes the poem. But
mhm.
you always keep the crossing throughs
Yes,
because it may be the start of the next thing. And
correct.
I have all these lines where if you're out somewhere and something occurs and you write it in your phone or you write it on a notepad or you wake up from a nap and you write something down and you end up with all these pieces of things. How do you does that occur for you and how do you
Does it?
deal with it
Oh, yeah.
when
Oh,
you have
yeah.
that mountain of words? How
Oh,
do you
yeah.
how do you
Absolutely,
change that
absolutely.
into something?
And without that mountain of words, you might be lost because somewhere in there, there's a start line that's going to give you the
Mm,
first line of a poem. One of my mentors was a really fine poet named Jack Moody, and he was an imagist poet. And what does that mean? Well, he believed Ezra Pound's notion of let's get rid of all the poeticisms like twas and twere and twill and, ere we
mm,
saw, that kind of stuff. Let's just stick with the image. And so Moody was an imagist poet, and all of his poems have exactly that essence to them of the image that could have come from a buried line in your notebook someplace that he then extrapolates into a full-fledged poem. Up to the very quiet edge of death, along 5 highways of converging air, the senses come like evening cattle home, and they meet there. That's the
mm,
beginning of a Moody poem. See, the
mm,
up to the very quiet along 5 highways of converging, like senses come. So he had this image, of the senses as cattle. I mean, what sense does that make in the real world?
mm,
Well, in the poetic world, it's a metaphor, for
mhm.
death, But you wouldn't get it if you didn't have that book of lost lines, I call it. I'd like to see your book of lost lines,
How
TR.
do you how do you how do you deal with those when you keep them somewhere? Like for me, I end up with a lot of notes mainly in the notes part of my phone now. I used to have notebooks and I
Mhm,
still have notebooks of a bunch of a bunch of lines,
mhm,
but now it's in the notes feature and every now and then you'll get a block of a poem, sometimes you'll get a whole poem, sometimes you'll get a line from a story you've already written or that you're thinking about writing
mhm,
or that you just don't recognize as I've
mhm.
said before. But when I get those and I start looking back through them and I'm like, this is an unwieldy document now. It's 20 to 40 pages and I print it out because I want to save it. I don't want to lose it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I back it up or I email it to myself or I email it to myself and then print it out. But then I take those lines and if I have whole poems or most of poems, I set those aside somewhere. And then the lines I'll cut up just like scissors on the paper and have these little
Yeah.
fortune cookie type things of lines. And
Perfect.
then I
Perfect.
put them in different piles and say, this sounds like poetry to me. This sounds like the line from a science fiction thing. Here's just an idea that I'm not sure what that is yet. And then I can arrange those sometime. Usually I do it before I write or after I write if I'm setting a time aside for it. And then, or just when the moment calls and says, hey, you need to go do these things. So you put all those out and you go, this feels like lines of a poem. You arrange them a certain way. Maybe you have to add some, maybe you take some away, but all of that, it's those poems are there. Those lines are there. Those conversations are there in that. And I wonder how many people, if they do write down all those things when they occur, how many then see it as insurmountable and like, I can't deal with this 50-page document of random things. So that's how I deal with it as I
Yeah,
cut them
well,
up.
you touch on two things that are, I think, very important. One is if you were a sculptor, we would call that notebook with all those pieces found objects. And
Mm,
Marcel Duchamp did exactly that. He found these things and he found a way to put them together, right? So that's really important for a poet to realize. That goes back to the Gallo statement. All the arts are interconnected. So you have your found objects there. Only thing you have to do is pull it out and see what it relates to something else. So I don't like to use this word, you construct a poem
mm,
the same way Duchamp constructed a piece of sculpture. See, and I think that is really, really the other thing that you touch on is this notion, the quantity of things goes to the idea you said it earlier, you always write more than you use, right? You always write more than you publish. And you say you didn't know, would I get that? Well, yeah, it came, it was there, it's been there in pieces. But you always have to go back to the source of where those things came from and look at them in isolation, which you do
mm.
when you say when you cut it up, you cut it out. I call that unpacking. You take this
Okay.
line and you say, well, wow, what in the world can this be? What's hiding under those words? So you gradually unpack it. And when you unpack it, you get another line and another line. And pretty soon you've written something that didn't exist before, that came out of somewhere, the dark forest, whatever it is. You've put it together, and lo and behold, it's all related, and you just didn't know it. And I think that's the risk that a poet has to take is one, writing and say, well, this is nonsense. I can throw that one away. Or holy cow, I didn't know I'd gotten that. Two very
Mm.
different products, right? And you're sitting right on top of a gold mine. Why don't you send me that 50-page?
How do you deal with that when you get that much built up? How do you sort that out in your mind or on paper?
Okay. All right. You're asking me my process. All right.
I
I
am.
have an idea as I'm writing a novel. Um, I never start writing a scene. Because I believe that novels are made with scenes, fundamental unit of structure kind of thing. I start writing about the writing. I take the idea. For instance, the novel that I'm working on now, the image of the character came. It just, I don't know when it came, but I had to write it down. He's sort of blind in one eye, in his left eye, and he has a limp in his left leg. And he was called, I called him the one-eyed man. Well, that's kind of a cliche, but as I start to dig into him, I say, well, wait a minute now. How did he get wounded? How did he lose the eye? So I start to build a character. So I'm writing about the writing long time before I ever write a scene. Well, then once I get all the place, then I realize, well, where does it take place? I co-wrote a book with Robert Ray called The Weekend Novelist Writes a Mystery, where we were perplexed with, well, when you start a book or a scene, what is the first thing you start with? And we thought and we thought and we wrote and we wrote and we finally realized first there are places, then people come into the places, they then talk about things in the places, or they fight, they make love, they kill one another. Somebody else comes in, that's an intruder. So we started to see that there's an inherent structure that our minds wants us to observe, but we
Mm.
first must write about what we're going to write. So to answer your question, I first write about the writing until I get what you said, the character unknown, then I know him. What does he look like? What does he wear? What does he speak like? Then I get the character, then I can put him into a place. So the next thing I do is say, well, where do all these things occur? I call them the setting. See, that's how I approach it. And then long towards morning, 200 pages later, I write my first scene.
Okay.
See, so it's like then at that point, it's like the guy is talking to me and I'm taking dictation from him. I'm not pushing him. And that goes back to that Chandler thing. When I'm writing fast, it feels like the words are pushing me. When I'm writing slow, I'm pushing the words. If I let the character push me, then I know I'm right. See,
Yeah, I like that.
yeah,
It's like you're looking through a keyhole and you see this thing, you just see part of it, and then
perfect
as you
metaphor.
understand that more, you can, maybe you are, I don't know if you go with, you can unlock the door or you can go through the keyhole, and
Yeah,
then you can
yeah,
see the setting.
yes.
That seems like it would work nicely with your screenplay, writing screenplay,
Absolutely,
because
absolutely,
you just
absolutely.
say, you can just throw the setting out there as exterior night,
Yes,
a
perfect,
diner.
perfect.
Yeah.
Yes,
Mm.
exactly. Interior bar room,
Yeah.
interior basement, hot water heater, boiling cauldron. Guy jams his fist into the boiling cauldron. Whoa, now you got some action.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah.
How did, when you started writing novels and screenplay, which one came first?
Well, this is interesting. Remember, early on, I think we were talking before, I said I could tell by the first line whether this was going to be a poem, a short story, or the beginning of a novel.
Hmm.
So what I started doing was my first book that I wrote, no publication, but pieces of it were published. I called it a generative mythology because I was using these ideas to write little short stories. And as I wrote the short stories, then I became, and this dovetails with what I said also about technique. As I acquired more techniques for handling these things, I could then write longer because I had better control of the words and the techniques. And like you just said, character, object, action, you know, and once I got that in hand, then the novels sort of flowed, and now I very rarely write a short story because everything wants to be expanded
Mm.
broader and deeper and carry more weight. So, that I hope that answers that question, you know. But I think it's a good way to write about discover this thing that you're going to write and call a novel, and then write it and see what it comes out as a short story or a novel. And you find some satisfaction in knowing, once again, that you're not in control. There's something else that is in control. It's that other thing out there, that those critters in that dark forest, whatever your metaphor is, you know,
Mhm.
they're helping you. And then pretty soon you're listening to the characters and they're telling you what to say, you know.
Yeah.
Uh,
Have you been surprised with a screenplay before, where in a novel you know the character and you're writing down, you have all those interactions. So in a sense, it's filtered through you, or however you want to say it. But in a screenplay, you're doing more of directions or an idea to a director, and then you have the actors that then put in their little piece. Have you been surprised in seeing
oh
any
yeah,
of your
yeah. See,
screenplay come to life?
yeah. I worked with some screenwriters at the university, and they were always really adamant that you not put yourself in the screenplay. All right, that you have to stay out, that you have to let the characters speak and let them say. And so there's this at that point, I learned something that was really beneficial. Well, everything I learned is beneficial in one way, but they were talking about dialogue, and William Goldman was brought into, and he describes it in his book called Adventures in the Screenwrite in the screen in the yeah in the screen world, something like that, in the screen trade. He was brought in because a an actor had said of the script, I can't speak these words. I can't say these words as they're written because they were fake. They weren't real words. So Goldman comes in and he rewrites the dialogue. In other words, he had to listen to the character, not the actor. He had to listen to the character and not the writer. He had to listen to what the character was feeling in order to find the words. So what he actually wound up doing was reshaping the words so that the actor could say them, because the saying is if the words don't fit in his mouth, they won't fit in the listener's ear. There's got
Mm,
to be a uniformity there, you know. And so that's kind of a roundabout way of avoiding a direct answer to your question, which I'm good at,
mhm.
by the way.
Yeah, that's good.
Sorry, just had to laugh at my own joke.
Yeah, yeah, it's good. I mean, I still think it answers the "Are you surprised by it?" Like it takes a different direction than you thought
Yes,
because either the strength of the character or the strength of the actor. Like the actor matters. The actor's
exactly,
take
exactly.
and feel of that character matters.
Exactly, and I think that's what Goldman was finding out was what is in the character that the actor has to find in himself, and that's Stanislavski, you know,
Mm,
that the actor has to find his in his own pain and experience aspects that he can bring to the character, and that makes the character live, and every actor goes through that. You and I are writers of words and characters, so we're actually overburdened because you not only when you write a novel or a short story or a screenplay, you have to be not only the character A, but you have to be characters A, B, C, and D. You have to be all of them. So the burden on you is enormous. The actor, hell, he just has one job. That's to be this
mm.
character, stay in there. But the writer, my goodness, you've got to be all of them. That's why there's so many crazy writers. They don't know who they are, you know.
Ah, yeah, that makes sense. How do essays come into poetry, screenwriting, and novels? How'd you get into that?
Okay. For years, I wrote for a little magazine called Pig Iron out of Youngstown, Ohio. Um, and I wrote a serialized novel called The Stolen House in episodes in that. And then as I wrote more, Jim Villani, who was the publisher, wanted me to start writing introductions and essays. So I started writing introductions. And one of the introductions that I wrote was an essay called The World Out of Whack. And I was in the Northwest, and so I was thinking about what's happening to our natural resources up here, like the Columbia River is an enormous river that used to carry hundreds of millions of salmon, and now it's down to just a trickle of the salmon. So we have watched the decay of this resource. So the essay was titled "The World Out of Whack and How Do We Set It Right." That set me off on the idea of writing a number of essays. So I wrote an essay called "The Strong Man," which was the notion that the good guy and the bad guy actually do the same things to one another, but the good guy does it for the right reason and the bad guy does it for the wrong reason. And
Hmm.
that sort of set me off. And I would write essays just, in writing practice, I would sit down and write an essay. And in one of those moments, I got the idea from my grandchildren. What can I actually give my grandchildren? I mean, what do we give them? So I started asking myself, what is wisdom? And wrote a series of essays on wisdom. What is it? How do you get it? How do you know you got it? And that became the book of essays. What do I know? And I continue to write essays. And as I go back to that original statement, I can tell from the beginning whether it's going to be an essay, a um, poem, a short story, or the beginning of a novel, or even a screenplay, because the essence is always packed so tightly that you recognize it immediately.
Mm,
And so the idea that I've always followed here is take what comes. If it's an essay, write the essay. If it's a short story, write the short story. Don't be afraid. I think fear, you mentioned it earlier, will it be there when I want to,
mm,
to go to it? Fear holds us back a lot. And if you can let go of fear, let me put it this way, TR. I think a lot of writers are obsessed with being loved. You know, the first
mm.
thing they ask somebody when they read their poem or their word is, "Did you like it?" And as soon as you ask them if they liked it, you've lost. You've lost the game already. See, you've
Yeah.
got to write it because you had to write it, and whether they like it or not is immaterial. You wrote
Mm,
it, and you had to write it, and that is your product. And you can't. So once you can give up the need to be loved, then you can take these jewels and shine them and polish them and turn them into, and they become you. They become part of you, just exactly like you clip your fingernails. They're part of you, and you can see them and you can feel them. And nobody's going to like your fingernail clippings, right? But you can sure
there's probably
put.
somebody out there that will.
Oh, you're right. I forgot the human plasticity is really
Yeah.
great. Yeah, you nailed that one too, didn't you?
Otherwise, I've been saving them up in a Ziploc bag for nothing.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so um,
Well,
well, let
then
me ask
here's a
you, you've written poetry, you've got at least 3 poetry books. What do you have, short stories or a novel or screenplay?
I what I was going to do after that first poetry book, which was it spanned about 20 years of poetry, and
Mhm.
I thought, let me do this, and then I'm going to do a book of short stories. And it ended up I was just in the, I guess the draw of poetry wouldn't let me go, or I didn't want to let it go, or a little bit of both. And I ended up doing 3 years of poetry,
Okay,
and that came to 3 books. And I still have some short stories, not that many. I
okay.
have a lot of ideas for short stories, and that's how
Yeah,
I keep my
yeah,
ideas like that. I'll say this is a good novel, this is a good short story, this is a poem, and I have
okay.
them in separate like files
Yeah,
of
so you and I
ideas.
you and I are a lot the same in that sense. Then that it's a short story could be and is, it's one thing that I wanted to share with you that has helped me a great deal. And this is something I learned from Bob Ray, who is a novelist, and he wrote a detective series called the Matt Murdock series, and he wrote a book called The Weekend Novelist, and he and I collaborated together on a book called The Weekend Novelist Writes a Mystery. And he taught me, you're not writing a book, you're writing a scene. And then you write another scene and
Mm,
another scene. And pretty soon, if you've done some structural stuff, you wind up with a novel. And it's the same thing with short stories. You can't write a book of short stories. You have to write one story and the second story. And I learned
mm.
that in my little book called Throwback, working with Bob. And it's a collection of short stories. Uh, and then in Terminal Weird, which was my first short story book, I realized that, I had set out to call it a generative mythology, but really what it was they're not really connected. They're individual short stories. So I wasn't writing a book of short stories. I was
Mm,
writing a bunch of short stories that I put into a book,
yeah.
and that helped me just infinitely to get control of this outpouring that keeps coming and doesn't want to stop you know uh,
Yeah. There's not enough time in a day to write it all for sure.
yeah,
Here's a question that may bother you, but how do you think, hmm, or what would you consider success for a poet?
for a
I
poet.
know that, yep. I know we just talked about how you can't be bothered if people like it or not, but
Yeah,
I have my way and I'll share it with you after I hear yours. But
okay,
what's, how do you measure success for a poet where you would go, that seems
okay.
successful?
I think that it's on an individual scale. Well, Dennis Must, a writer friend of mine, he writes some very interesting things, but he says, if I can find just one person who gets it, then I'm successful.
Mm,
If one person gets it, because you can't always write what's expected, and a poet who writes Edgar Guest type poetry, you're writing exactly what's expected. I think that success to me as a poet is when people stop and say, I had to read that twice. It was so beautiful. I had to read that twice to figure out what he was saying. So what it is I would consider it a success if my writing opens up the mind of the reader, and the reader's generous enough to open up to what I might be saying, that I can take him or her along on a journey with me, a journey of self-discovery or a journey of discovery, so that I feel that I've connected with them. And when I say, you can't write for them, what you can do is write with them in hopes that they'll join you on this trip to wherever you're
mm.
going. To me,
I
that's
like it.
success.
I like it. I like it. I feel like on this road to, if you feel like you need to measure success for that, then I would say just from reading Leaves of Grass,
Mhm.
there's not a whole lot of poems in that I would go back and say those are memorable. I mean, there's a lot I remember, but there's not a lot where just in normal life I'm walking around and then I think, "Oh me, oh life,"
Yeah,
you know.
yeah,
I that so that poem is my favorite of Whitman's, the "Oh me, oh life." But
right.
I think that if you have a book of poetry, however many poems you have in that book, 50, 100, 200, whatever you have in there, that if there's a person out there that looks at one of them, like they took the time to read the book, that's a win. And
Yep,
then if
yes,
you if they say I liked this one poem, then for a poet, I think that's success.
I do
And
too. Yes,
if you have
yes,
somebody that even if they say there's not a poem I like, but I do remember these few lines,
perfect.
and they've committed them to memory, so they've
Yeah,
resonated somehow with them,
yeah.
and they've tried to understand them as you've tried to understand them, then I think that's success too.
Boy,
And
you nail it. Boy, see, we share that, and
yeah,
Dennis Musk shares that with you, you know. Uh, I really appreciate. I wish we had a transcription of this because I'd write that down.
mm.
What you just
I'll
said.
send you I'll send you a
Okay,
transcript.
okay, because
This is good stuff. This is good stuff here.
this is a hard thing for a poet. See, because you don't want to write what everybody else has written, but if you write too far out, then you go beyond your reader's patience or time or whatever it is, comprehension. So you got to
Mm,
backtrack. A lot of it, writing about sex is really interesting. So what I do, I always write to the edge and then pull back to my comfort zone. And it's kind of the same thing with poetry. Write it out as far as you can go and then pull back a little bit because you've gone just a little bit too far. But don't give up your uniqueness. Never sacrifice your uniqueness to taste. Otherwise there's no art progress. There is
yeah.
there's no future. We're just writing the same thing over and over and over again. And I don't mind writing genre, but genre has all fixed parts. And if you write poetry that has fixed parts and it always does the same thing, that gets boring too. So
Yeah, if you know what that next word's gonna
you
be when
know
you're
what it's
reading
going to
it,
be. Yep,
then that's
exactly.
I
Yep,
I mean, sometimes you can throw a poem in there every now and then that rhymes, but I'd much rather have a poem that had a lyricism to it that if you read it a certain way, and hopefully you can get to that with the way the writer writes it, like the capitals and the punctuation and the ends of the lines, that you could look at a poem and go, I have no idea what this means, but I like the way it sounds.
right.
Or you could look at it and say, I'm this is how I read it. And then somebody else comes along and goes, no, 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 no. Try reading it like this.
Yeah,
And then you go, oh, that unlocks it for me.
yep,
That's
yep,
like Millville for me is like that, where you can read it and go, I really am lost in what he's trying to explain here about whaling. But if you just read it, you can feel that lyricism in it.
Yeah,
And you're like, okay,
yeah.
there's something to this, there's something to it. And I just need to go back and study it a little more. But I do like that if
Well, you
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 have,
you t you touch on it so well there. Poetry is meant to be read. You've said
mm,
lyricism. Well, the reason we call it lyric poetry is the Greek poets played a lyre, which was a stringed
mm,
instrument, and they sang their poems. It's a song. We got to remember that. So if you touch the lyrical aspect of it, you touch the rhythm, you touch the breath, you touch the beat, you touch the cadence, and all of that is the music combined that so many poets forget. They're so, I hate to say it this way, they're so locked into self-experience that they
mm,
forget that there's a universal element to this, and it's called song. And
mm,
we've got the beat and the rhythm and these things, and you touch it. I subscribe to that exactly.
yeah,
If you
it's
can
so
get the
great.
first, say again,
It's so great when you have a poem and it starts a certain way and you have this either the build up or whatever. And so you're reading it, you're like, okay, that's how that goes, that's how that goes. And then you get to this part where it's like you got to read this quicker. This
yes,
is whatever they, not al
yeah,
dente, but whatever,
yeah,
allegro.
yeah,
You gotta speed
allegro,
that
yeah,
up.
yeah,
And I really like when you put that, when you put something together and you go, oh, I've been reading it wrong, whether it's something that someone else wrote or something that you wrote. And then you can go, oh, this is how you're supposed to read it. It needed
yeah,
this line in here to make this transition. And man, that's great. That's that part of poetry I love, like when you're writing a novel and the characters start having a conversation you didn't think they were going to have, and you're like, oh, it's writing itself. And it
they're
goes
taking
back to
over
what you
your
were,
book, of course, they're taking over.
yeah,
They're
it's
shutting
that
you
part
out, they don't care
where
about you.
where you're talking
Yeah,
about the words pushing you instead of you pushing the words. I think that's beautiful.
yeah, yeah,
That's it. That is it. When you get
yeah,
into that state, it's great.
yeah.
That's
Well,
why I keep
going
coming back to writing, I think.
absolutely. Actually, I just had a firsthand experience with that difference. I published, Man Alone and then had turned it into an audiobook, and I was working with the sound engineer, and he said, "You're reading too fast. You've got to slow it down." He said, "In an audiobook, there's no such thing as too slow." And so I started realizing I was reading the fiction as though it were poetry for different cadence, for accent, for, different rhythms like
Mm,
that. And I backed away from that and started realizing that what I have to read is the significant word in each sentence, not I have
mm,
to read beyond the cadences of it, although there are times when good prose is very incantatory.
yeah.
But he taught me in like 1 hour how to read fiction and how to break the
Wow.
poetry voice. It was a
Okay.
stunning experience. Talk about learning at a late point in life. Well, this was really big for me, and you touch on it right there. When you say you read it, you feel it, you know, hearing a poem is like, the God speaking to you when it works. You
Hmm.
just there's just so many things in poetry. I love poetry. I will
Yeah.
never stop writing poetry. You know,
I
um,
think even when you're measuring success of that, or measuring, maybe trying to answer that question of, is this worth my time? Where I don't really ask myself that for poetry. I do
mhm,
for podcasting sometimes. Like, what am I doing here? What's my point?
yeah,
But the with poetry, it if I like it, I think it's a success because I understand it's not just from me, it's from somewhere else. And then I also feel like if I like it, there's someone else that likes it too. It's just, are they ever going to come across this?
yeah,
So you
yeah,
don't know. But
yeah.
whatever that force was that helped you assemble it, maybe that same force is working in other ways through this reality, and it brings people to what they need to see when they need to see it. And maybe it's 200 years down the road, somebody reads a poem and goes, oh, that's good. And then wherever you are, you're like, oh, that's a win. That's a win.
Well, see, you touch on something I think that a lot of us forget is there's an I don't like to say it this way, but I'll say it anyway. There's an educational aspect to poetry. You have to teach people something about
mm,
your vision of the world in hopes that your vision will enhance their vision and make them see something bigger and better. You know,
mm,
I think of Thomas's poem, "The force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age." And what's he talking about there? Talking about the universal connection of all human beings to this notion of growing up, and it's a mystical force. The force that through the green fuse, the force that drives the grass to grow, drives me as a human being. He's pointing out a connectivity between nature and human. And that's
mm.
teaching in a way. It's subliminal as all get out, but it's
Yeah.
still teaching. And you said, even if it's 200 years from now, somebody reads something and they see something that they hadn't seen before, it enhances their view of the world. They become bigger, they become better, and you become better for having created that thing that makes them bigger and better.
Mm,
And that's why
hmm.
you're a poet, I think.
Yeah.
You
Mm,
know.
I like it. I like it.
Well, I hate to bring up time, but your recording time shows me we're an hour and 6 minutes into this.
We
You know.
do. Do you have you got a place to go? You got somewhere to be?
Oh, no, no, no. One
Okay.
o'clock, I have a meeting with another poet, by the way. His name's Larry Christ, and he does the timed writing thing every day. He sits down, sets his timer for 45 minutes, and writes. And then he goes back and filters what he's got to see if there's a poem or something in there. And I mean, you're so accomplished, I don't dare suggest it, but you might try that sometime.
The
Try
timed
time,
timed
try time.
writing. Yep, I've tried that before. I was in a writing group called
Oh,
Shut Up and
okay.
Write, where you get together with the writing folk, and this was in a coffee shop actually in Salem, Oregon, and you just write for an hour and then you talk
Excellent.
after. You don't have to talk about what you wrote. You don't have to read anybody else's stuff. They don't read yours. But I did like the social aspect of it because
Yeah,
again, I like talking to
yeah,
the creative writing type people.
right.
And yeah, that was good. And I've tried that at home before and it works where if you're with the it goes to that discipline part of it. So if
Yeah,
you're going to say, I'm going to try to write 10 poems a month for a year and see how that goes.
yeah,
And then, or I'm going to try to, you create those things of accountability for you where you say, I'm going to write this novella or this short novel and I want to get it to somebody to read by this date. So you tell them that that's what you're doing. And then they're like, oh, okay, they're looking forward to it. So whether they're really looking forward to it or not, I'm not sure. But in your mind, you're like, I got to get this done because I got to send it to this person. And I
yeah.
don't want to send the first draft. I want to send like the fourth or fifth draft.
Exactly.
I don't,
Good,
I don't
good.
want to send the trash out
Very,
the door.
very good. I sort of used to work that way. I had a friend named Frank Araujo who was a linguist and also a novelist writer. And what I would do is I was writing something, I would just write it to him in a letter. Dear Frank, I'm going to send you this piece that I'm writing called, Property in Common. I think it's a short story, but I don't know. So I'll just write it to him in a letter because if I had one reader, I felt that I was able to produce it better than if I was just
Yeah.
writing it cold. So that one reader guy saved my ass a lot,
Yep.
because the short stories that came then came in letters that were finite. They weren't going to become a novel, you know, and it really saved a lot of time. But the important aspect that you mentioned, I got to send it to somebody at a certain time, so that's my deadline, and I got to produce it by then.
Hmm.
Not the first draft. Phew. In screenwriting, the first draft is not the first thing that's written. It's the 15th rewrite, and it's the first draft you dare to show to somebody.
Yeah. 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 I agree.
Yeah.
It's and I like the ability of having some accountability, but also if somebody else says to you, I'm going to send you a thing and they do the same thing except they're sending it to you. I take that really seriously because I know
Oh,
when I
oh,
send something to someone, as soon as I send it, I think, I wonder when they're going to send that back.
yeah,
And then I'm thinking about it all the time. I'm
Yeah.
still working on other stuff, but I'm always, that's in my mind. So I realize when I get things from people and they want me to read them, then I got to do it. I have to do it seriously. So I need to sit down and devote some time to it, and I need to get it back to them timely. And I like to use different color pens if I print it out and then write it, which is my preferred way, write notes on it. So I'll have the every now and then the grammatical thing, because if you're just reading through it and you see a word dropped or a quotation dropped or whatever, why not throw
Yeah.
a throw a a little mark on that? But I'm not great at all that. So if you're getting grammar corrections from me, it's obvious. It's obvious.
Yeah.
So I'll throw that out there, and then I'll have other different color inks for like comments about the story. Where is this is this person saying this now because I thought they were killed in the last paragraph? So a little, just a question, and then I'll have also a different color for comments like, I bet this person's going to regret doing this, or I really like this line, or you underline it and then say, yes, I really, whatever. Just put something
Well,
there so
that
it gives
color
them a little feedback when they're reading it.
that color coding is really brilliant, because everything looks flat. The type is the same size, the ink is the same
Mhm.
color, the paper's the same color, and any deviate, it's like a slanted line. If you want to remember something, put it at an angle on your wall. Don't put it straight because it's
Mm.
out of whack. And those little color coded things draw the reader's attention to it more than the uniformity of the text and all that kind of stuff. What you said touched me really deeply here because this guy sends me something. His name is Jack Smith, and that's his real name, Jack Smith. I mentioned him before.
I
He's
think
written
so.
two novels recently. One is called Madness. The other is called Amor Fati. And he wanted me to write a blurb for his Amor Fati, which is a novella. And so I hacked one out. And then he said, the publisher wants me to write an introduction, and I said, "Oh God, I can't get to it because I got a bunch of stuff coming up." And I answered him that note, and then immediately I said, "Wait a minute, why don't I do it?" So I closed my eyes at my typewriter. I wrote this introduction and I sent it to him, and said, "Will this work?" Because I'd used the time writing technique of writing
Mm.
blind. I wrote it
Nice.
and he says, "Yeah, we're going to use it." And I thought, well, that's interesting. So what I did was exactly what you said. He sent me some stuff. He wanted to know when I would get to it. And I said, I can't get to it. But then I realized, wait a minute, why can't I get to it? I know how to do this. So I wrote it, and I'll send it to you if you want to read it, because it seals it. It contains the essence of the novel that called Amor Fati, and I consider it as though it had been written almost as a screenplay. So
Mm.
I gave him insight into his own work, and he wrote me back and said, "That's what I was hoping somebody would see." So I saw, so this whole
Nice.
process of giving it back and forth and meeting the expectation, and a lot of writers are very selfish. They won't help somebody out, and I'm just the opposite. I'll help anybody who asks for it. Help.
It's the
That's why.
perfect procrastination. I
Yes,
can't work
exactly.
on this because I got to do this other thing. Yeah.
Exactly,
And it
exactly.
does put into perspective about how excited you are about working on whatever.
Yeah,
So if you have something to do, whether it's a chore around the house and you're writing this other thing, and then it's kind of like when you flip a coin to make a decision
yeah,
and you say, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do this. And then you flip a coin and it's not the one you wanted and you know it instantly.
yeah,
And you go, oh, well,
yeah,
I'm going to do this other thing anyway.
yeah, yeah,
So then you have to decide, are you going to go against the rules of chance, or are you going to do what you knew you wanted to do anyway?
yeah,
So
exactly,
it's
exactly. So anyway, Jack now has both a blurb for Amor Fati and an introduction. What I feel honored to be asked to write the introduction,
yeah.
but I know that he wouldn't have asked me to write the introduction if I hadn't written the blurb that gave him the essence of the book, and then the other. But that, I was I don't know how to say it, TR, but proud, no, but honored, to be
Yeah.
asked to write an introduction that's
Yeah.
something, because that's generally the first thing people see when they pick up a book is, what is this, so I felt really honored to do that. And I think
I've
I did a
read
good
books because of introductions,
exactly,
because of a good
exactly.
introduction. So
Yep,
yeah,
yep,
it's an honor. It's
yep,
something that matters.
yep.
Okay, well here I'm concerned about time. Plus, I got to
Okay,
take Tia Beanie to the vet to get
okay,
her ear
okay.
drain removed. But what a great conversation! I could talk to you for hours. I suspected that was going to be the case anyway, because I think when I look back at the types of people I can talk to the longest, it's police and poets. So I'm not sure.
The P people.
Yeah, yeah,
That's great. That's great. Well, I enjoyed this too. I'm very glad
yeah.
that you had me on. Um, yeah, I always
What's what's the best way for people to be able to follow what you're doing? Is it through your
okay.
website?
The website is jackremick.com.
Okay.
Okay. And on the jackremick.com, we have both a way to register for the interactive rewrite work masterclass and a list of all my books that, well, they take you to Amazon. They're all up there. Um, and that is the best way to do it. Um, I think my email is jackremick@gmail.com if people were interested in writing to something. And if you, I have you do, I want to send you a couple things here that we had talked about. Do I
Yeah,
send
yeah.
them to the one you sent me, or do you have a private line?
You can send them to that one, to the
Okay.
podcast
Okay.
one. I'll get them. I check that all the time.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. So that your website link will be in the show notes. So, and
Okay.
this will be on Spotify and YouTube. And
Okay. Excellent.
um,
Excellent.
I definitely would like to talk again in the future. There's a lot of things on my outline of topics that we didn't get to, but that's good. It's
Okay,
good
well,
to
what I
leave
need
people
what I
learning.
need is your name so I can see where I can get your poetry books.
Oh, TR Monroe is
T.R.
it's there
Monroe.
on
Okay,
Amazon. Yeah.
okay.
T
Uh,
comma R period Monroe.
T comma R comma Monroe. Monroe.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. Good. All right. Perfect. Yeah, well, let's get together sometime. And if you are interested in some of the people I know, Um, well, I don't how could
Yeah.
I know if you'd be interested in them if you don't know them? But I have a coterie or a friendship with a number of writers, all of whom are articulate. Do you interview women at all, women poets?
Yeah. Yeah. They're
Okay.
people too.
Okay, because I have two fantastic poets that I work and read with. One is named Anne Sweet, and she has a really fine book called Nailed to the Sky. And Priscilla Long, who is with me. Well, Anne is also in the anthology, the Seattle 5+1, but Priscilla Long has written a magic book called Holy Magic, and she was also she won a big prize for writing essays for a science magazine, American Scientist, I think it was. She wrote a 2-year series for them. So she's got a broad mind and is articulate as all get out. And I know she would love talking to another poet, of
Okay.
your
Yeah.
of your stature and quality. So, well, no, look, you've told me stuff, I appreciate understanding someone else's creative process. I mean, this is so important. You know, we both agree that it comes from somewhere dark. You have to work it. You take it. You do it. You cross it out. This is the real craft of poetry. It's not
Mm,
just that first splash of insight. That's how you turn words into images. And so, anyway, I've enjoyed this more than I
yeah.
can tell you. You know.
Yeah. It's
So
great. It's been great.
okay.
I look
O
forward to it again.
okay.
Um, we're going to have this little musical exit and then we'll talk about the publication dates on the other side of that.
Okay,
Okay.
perfect.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Thanks.